Welcome and thank you for joining this open Zoom on agriculture. My name's Sam King and I'll be your facilitator today. I'll shortly explain how today's going to run, but first I'd like to invite Bevan to open us with a karakia.
O ngā mihi nui ki a tātou I runga I te pāka whakata reo nei, anei te karakia timatanga. Paua ki runga, paua ki raro, ruia, tuia, kōkiritia, kia mau, kia au, kia ora ai. He pikinga ki te rangi, kia tū I tae ao. He pau e hora, he pau a rangi, kia hora a papa, haumi e hui e, tae ki. So just as a bit of a translation, this karakia speaks to our name, He Pauarangi, which communicates the sacred bond between Rangi Nui and the sky. Papatua Nuku, the earth. It speaks to our duty to restore balance from human transgressions. Pau can represent support, a metaphoric post, a gathering of people to support a cause or to put a stake in the ground. Kōkiritia is also to champion a cause. Hora is to make public and put on display, which is what we're doing today. Ruia is sow. It can mean sow or cast away, discard, plant that which is needed, and a reminder to take what is needed and leave that which is not needed, and also balance. So being able to feed ourselves and others. So that's the role of agriculture. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Bevan, thank you. So I'll shortly hand over to James, who will do a short presentation, and then there'll be an opportunity to have your questions answered. If you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A section. Please do that whenever you feel like it. We're monitoring the background and we'll try and get to every question. But if we don't have time to get to yours, please feel free to email us at hello@climatecommission.govt.nz. We'd really love to know who's joining us today. So if you're comfortable, please put your name and organisation in the chat section so we know who's here. Finally, just a reminder that this session is recorded and will be made available on the Commission's website afterwards. With that, I'll hand over to James.
Thanks, Sam. Tēnā koto katoa. Good morning, everyone. My name is James Aotearoa. I'm a principal analyst in the Land and Waste team, and my focus area is agriculture. Shortly, I'll give you a general overview of the Commission's approach to the draft advice. This will be followed by the key messages and proposed recommendations in the draft advice on agriculture. I'll also touch on emissions pricing in general, as this may be of interest to some of you. To conclude, I will then hand back to Sam to lead us through the question and answer segment of the session. Let me start by explaining the role of the Climate Change Commission. The Commission was created in 2019 with the passing of the Zero Carbon Bill, amending the Climate Change Response Act. Our roles under the Act are varied, and the factors we must consider are detailed and specific. Some of the core considerations are distributional effects, including intergenerational, economic effects, social, cultural, and environmental circumstances. The Act requires the Commission to consider the Crown Maori relationship, Te Ao Maori, and specific effects on iwi Maori in all the advice it gives to the government. We are an independent Crown entity with an advisory role within the wider system for climate change policy in Aotearoa. We provide regular, independent, and evidence-based advice to government on climate action and monitor progress towards New Zealand's climate goals. As part of this, we assess the adequacy of government action and share our conclusions publicly. The conclusions and recommendations of the Commission are made by our board, not a government minister or cabinet. These conclusions and recommendations are founded on the science, evidence, and analysis carried out by our staff, and importantly, based on input from stakeholders and the people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Commission's focus has been on providing advice on ways forward that are effective, equitable, practical, and affordable. Our legislation guides us to consider both ambition and achievability. We provide advice that enables Aotearoa to earn its way in the world and that supports future pathways that are responsible, fair, and sustainable. It is important that these pathways do not broaden current inequalities. Rather, our pathways forward need to work alongside efforts to address other well-being challenges, like healthy housing, urban form, the future of transport, and the state of our natural environment. We know the transition to a low emissions and climate resilient society brings a mix of opportunities, benefits, challenges, and costs. And the effects, good and bad, will be felt by all of us. At the core of the transition is people. Ultimately, it is people in communities, people in business, and people on the ground who are the ones who will act to reduce our emissions and adapt us to climate change. The Climate Change Commission was established to support the transition. So how does this piece of advice fit into our work program? We are currently consulting on our draft advice to government on the direction of policy for actions New Zealand must take to meet its climate goals and address climate change. It is then the role of the government of the day to decide on the specific policy choices to give effect to the emissions reduction plan. We understand that people are at the center of policy. Therefore, it is important that our advice reflects what Kiwis are experiencing and care about. Having input from people is vitally important to us. Consultation is a chance for us to share our thinking and for people to submit on what we have said in our draft advice. We want to know if you think our recommendations reflect what you think is the correct path New Zealand should be taking to reduce emissions and meet our legislated targets. Once we've incorporated what we've heard, our final advice is due to the Minister by 31 December of this year. So how is this draft advice different from last time? The second emissions budget for the period 2026 to 2030 has been set. Now government needs a plan to deliver on it. Because the government now has its first emissions reduction plan in place, this draft advice is focused on building on the work already progressing. The Commission's work includes identifying where critical gaps might exist and where existing actions might need to be strengthened and accelerated to achieve the second emissions budget and the country's longer-term climate goals. Reflecting that there is already much climate action underway, the Commission's draft advice has fewer recommendations than our previous advice in 2021. We received feedback on our first advice that fewer recommendations would be more helpful. We have looked at how emissions pricing is likely to drive change for each sector and across the broader system. We have identified where barriers currently deter low emissions choices and where strategic investment can help drive change over the long term. This draft advice builds on the evidence base we have created through our previous advice. We have also gathered and analyzed data and evidence from a wide range of credible sources and reviewed a broad range of literature to support developing this draft advice. We have used both quantitative and qualitative tools to guide our analysis and tested the quality of our evidence, refining it along the way. The Commission has used two tools to formulate our advice. The first tool has helped us to prioritize which elements of our advice to raise as proposed recommendations. We have prioritized our draft advice against 6 aspects that are each critical to consider. And these are the potential for how the opportunity, policy, or enabler can help New Zealand meet the second emissions budget and beyond, taking into account scale, scientific evidence, technology, economic feasibility, and cost. We've also considered any gaps in policy, pace and timing of the action. Will the pace be sufficient to contribute to the second emissions budget, or will it lay the foundations for achieving future budgets and targets? What are the risks to realizing the potential and other risks associated with the action? Also considered are equity considerations, including intergenerational equity and distributional effects on sectors, regions, and social groups, and issues relevant to the Crown Maori relationship, Te Ao Maori, and specific effects on iwi Maori. What core benefits does the action bring, for example, to health, well-being, economic development, other environmental or ecological factors? These 6 aspects are distilled from the matters that we are required to consider under our Act. As part of this consultation, we are seeking feedback on the framework we have used and how we have prioritized action. We have also used the policy framework pictured here, which has helped us assess the direction of policy needed to support the priority actions. We have considered critical gaps in the current policy landscape, potential for core benefits, and well-being aspects. Consultation. So consultation on this draft advice opened on the 26th of April and will run for 8 weeks, closing on the 20th of June. We want to know if you think our recommendations reflect what you think is the correct path New Zealand should be taking to reduce emissions and meet our legislated targets. So we look forward to receiving your submissions. At the end, we will cover how you can make a submission. This information is also available on the Commission's website. Now let's get into the key messages in our draft advice on agriculture. Through the passing of the Zero Carbon Bill, the country set targets for biogenic methane reduction, in addition to the net zero target for long-lived gases. This includes a target for at least a 10% reduction below 2017 levels by 2030. New Zealand's main sources of biogenic methane emissions are from agriculture and waste, and reduction in emissions for both these sectors will be essential for meeting the 2030 biogenic methane target. The options for reducing farm emissions are developing rapidly, and if we are to take advantage of this, we need to quickly get our house in order so we can rapidly deploy them. The Commission has consistently advised that the priority is to get a system in place to price agricultural emissions and then rapidly refine it, rather than waiting for the perfect system to be developed and then implemented. It is crucial that agricultural emissions pricing is not delayed, as this would make it less likely for Aotearoa New Zealand to meet its climate targets. A basic farm-level system may provide a path to progress towards a more detailed and effective system, but it is important that the system advances as soon as possible over the second emissions budget period. Enhanced advisory and extension services can help farmers identify actions to improve economic, social, and environmental outcomes. Collaboration, co-design, and implementation of these services must be done in partnership with industry and iwi Māori to ensure an equitable transition. Streamlining the process for introducing new technologies could have several benefits, including helping the agricultural sector to reduce on-farm emissions without impacting production, reducing emissions sooner, and giving farmers more options in responding to an emissions price. Regulatory tools are vital to ensure that agricultural products from Aotearoa New Zealand are safe and trusted in overseas markets. However, the system means that it can take some time to get new technologies approved for widespread use. Diversifying agricultural land use can provide several benefits, including reducing emissions, diversifying income, building climate resilience, and enhancing environmental outcomes. Further investment in science will be required to diversify well and to avoid maladaptation. So now to the first proposed recommendation. So the first proposed recommendation the Commission is consulting on is that government enhance advisory and extension services to farmers to enable them to respond to pricing and to accelerate the adoption of emissions-efficient practices, appropriate land use diversification, and emerging technologies to reduce gross emissions. and these services should be co-designed and implemented in partnership with industry and iwi Māori. Second proposed recommendation is that government advance the agricultural emissions pricing system to enable recognition of a broader range of emissions reducing practices and technologies, and also incentivize gross emissions reductions in line with the 2050 target. I'll now briefly touch on emissions pricing in general, as this may interest some of you. Aotearoa New Zealand's climate policies need to encourage both decarbonization and forestry, as both have essential roles to play in the low emissions transition. The NZETS is a key tool for meeting emissions budgets and the 2050 target, but it is not currently structured to do this. In the near term, the NZETS is likely to drive extensive afforestation rather than gross emissions reductions. In the longer term, the NZETS will not provide the incentives for afforestation that are necessary to achieve net zero long-lived gas emissions by 2050. To support an equitable and sustainable low emissions strategy, change is needed so that NZETS incentives for gross emissions reductions are separated from those applying to forestry to prevent removals by forests from undermining gross emissions reductions. Change is also needed so that incentives for afforestation are maintained past the mid-2030s. The government needs to start working out how to do this now because of the long-term investment horizon of the forestry sector. Some iwi Māori have a significant stake in the NZETS, and any government processes and decisions about amending the NZETS must recognize the rights of iwi Māori and uphold Te Tiriti, the Treaty of Waitangi. Applying the principles of partnership, protection, and participation with iwi Māori will be crucial, so impacts for Māori collective landowners and iwi Māori foresters are understood and properly considered. The proposed recommendation to this effect is that government make the emissions pricing system consistent with delivering the specific levels of gross emissions for the second and third budgets and with the 2050 net zero target. By implementing an amended NZETS that separates the incentives for gross emissions reductions from those applying to forestry, and developing an approach that can provide durable incentives for net carbon dioxide removals by forests through to and beyond 2050. So what happens next? The Commission's consultation period started on the 26th of April and will run until the 20th of June. Our final advice report will be given to government in December. The government then decides which part of our advice need to be made into policy. Please visit our website to read our advice and to find out how to make a submission. You can stay in the loop on our consultation through our Twitter and LinkedIn. This concludes the presentation part of this session. I'll now hand back to Sam to lead us through the question and answer segment. Over to you, Sam.
Kia ora, James. Just wait a second, hopefully, for my video to catch up, and maybe for you to catch a breath, and for people to ask questions if they've got them. Please do put them in the question and answer section. Right, here we go. My video's up. So to start with, James, you talked about the advisory and extension services. Could you maybe give some examples of those services that would help our farmers achieve the outcomes?
Thanks, Sam. That's a great question, and it is one of those questions that we do get quite often when we engage with stakeholders. So I'll take some time to quickly explain. So what we're talking about here is that we understand that farmers and growers are being asked to reduce their emissions. And in that process, what we've heard from farmers is that they would want to be able to do that in a way that reduces emissions, but also limiting the impact that has on production. So therefore, what the Commission is recommending is that support be provided in the form of farm advisors and also extension services, that these are set up and that they are ready to support farmers to make changes that are suited to their own farms. And also, these support services must also enable farmers to overcome those barriers to adoption that are not otherwise about price. So in a nutshell, that is what we are recommending as the Commission.
Oh, thanks, James. So we've also heard a lot about pricing of agricultural emissions, and they can disproportionately impact certain sectors, for example, sheep and beef. You know, some modelling out there from the government shows this could be up to 20%. So how is the transition equitable?
Thanks, Sam. That is a great question as well. So the thing is that the Commission has said that if there is going to be implementation of an agricultural pricing system, there should be a consideration of what disruptive changes will result as a result of full exposure to an emissions price, and the considerations should be made as to whether that will result in material financial hardship. And the Commission does recommend that government, in a consistent way, assesses risks to all financial impacts, across all the sectors. So this is what the Commission has recommended. And in the case that it's deemed that there would be material financial hardship, the Commission, in our advice that went out last year, has said that the government should consider giving financial assistance so that the transition of the agricultural sector to meet that statutory targets can actually be met.
Thank you, James. Got a question here about the impacts on iwi Māori. Feel free to answer it, but if No, I might have a go. So is there any policy option that reflect the unique characteristics of Māori collectively owned land and to avoid disproportionate impacts on iwi Māori?
Right, can I pass that back on to you, Sam? If that's okay?
Sure. So we're aware that a large amount of Māori collectively owned land is out there, and that the land holding structure with multiple, sometimes up to thousands of individual owners, and the land being held in collective can make decision making and changing to adapt to regulatory policy such as this challenging. We're also aware that there is a lack of capital in such areas, as that land can't be used as collateral for loans. So both of those are really challenging characteristics of Māori collectively owned land under Te Ture Whenua, where our recommendation is that those issues need to be resolved, and Māori and iwi need to be supported to make the transition that is required. But the level of detail that's needed to do that is really the government's responsibility, whereas we set the high-level direction of policy. So maybe if we turn back to the extension services, a question here that MPI is already doing a lot. It's getting quite a bit of funding from the taxpayer. How does our advice on accelerating and expanding those services differ from what MPI is doing already?
Thanks, Sam. So the Commission is aware that actions and efforts are already underway as part of the actions that are happening within the first emissions budget period. But our draft advice, and specifically the proposed recommendation on extension services and advisory services, is specifically around accelerating and enhancing some of those services that are already in action. And the reason being that over time, there is an expectation that there will be a number of emissions reduction technologies that will come online, and that there's going to be the need for farmers to be able to be supported to adopt and for uptake of those. And therefore, it is crucial at the same time as the emissions pricing system is being advanced, that those services are actually enhanced. And also, if you look at the recommendation, the proposed recommendation itself, it also says that these should be implemented and co-designed with iwi Māori, so that's specifically speaking to the needs of iwi Māori. So that's a component that's quite apparent in that proposed recommendation on support services.
Sure, James. Got a question here about the ETS and specifically permanent forest category. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Matt Smith. Matt's one of our experts in this area. So Matt, the question is, what's the Commission's position on potential limits to the permanent forest category in the ETS? And should this conversation be revisited to ensure right tree, right place?
Sure, Sam. So our position on the limits on the permanent forestry category is that it's helpful but not sufficient. So in our advice, we looked at different ways that the government could address the current incentives in the ETS that are mostly driving forestry, and this is one of the options that we canvassed. And the issue is that even non-permanent straight production forestry would still drive these outcomes. So it sort of goes beyond just the permanent forest category.
Correct. If you'd just like to stay on the line, we've got another follow-up question about the New Zealand ETS.
Sure.
And so we're suggesting changes that will introduce more complexity to the system, for example, differential pricing, and suggesting this needs to happen by 2025, given government will not respond to the advice that we've got out in draft form until early 2024 at the earliest. Is it a realistic timeframe for new policy or regulation?
Sure, it's an understandable concern. The thing with this issue about differential pricing and the incentive for forestry is this isn't the first time that we've given this advice to government. We made this point in our advice on the first emission budgets in Aotearoa in 2021. And as well, we reiterated it in our ETS settings advice both last year and this year. And so the government's been considering this issue for some time. And earlier in the year, they announced a review of the ETS to kind of consider this issue. So it's already under active consideration by government. So kind of given that work has kind of already got a head of steam behind it, we think it is feasible to address this by 2025.
All right. While we're talking about praise, maybe it's a good time to answer the question we've got here on sequestration on farm. So what's the Commission's view about recognition of on-farm sequestration? That's probably for James rather than you, Matt. Sorry, just on that.
So the Commission's position, Sam, is that on-farm vegetation of all types have a variety of benefits beyond sequestration. Some of them that do include enhancing biodiversity and improving water quality. And the Commission thinks that these broader benefits should be recognized. The government proposal in the Section 215 report is that the NZETS be developed to include all forms of scientifically robust carbon sequestration. The Commission is yet to see what this new NZETS will look like, but it may not be the best suited option, as it is not suited to rewarding wider benefits that go beyond just carbon sequestration. So this is the Commission's view.
And talking of proposed agricultural pricing system, we've got a few questions on that. I think the first one is, what features do we recommend a detailed and granular agricultural emissions pricing system should have?
That's a very pertinent question, Sam, especially given that this is obviously one of the proposed recommendations in the draft advice. So this is how the Commission is thinking. The Commission thinks that the agricultural pricing system must have enough detail to recognize and incentivize a full range of mitigation options. And this will allow farmers to reduce on-farm emissions while limiting impacts on production. The Commission also thinks that the pricing system would recognize more inputs into on-farm calculations. And here, we're talking of For example, things like different types of feeds. And this would allow the calculator to reflect more on-farm actions. And then thirdly, the system would also provide more choice about responding to a price signal. And this will enable farmers to make the decisions that best align with their businesses. So this is the Commission's view of what we think a detailed and granular agricultural emissions pricing system should look like.
So I've got a question here about assistance you mentioned before in context of if there's material financial hardship. Got any thoughts on how the government should implement such assistance and how allocation would work?
So I guess in short, I would say that ultimately it is up to the government themselves to decide on the policy detail and what they would like to implement. But from the Commission's viewpoint, in terms of giving strategic direction on policy, we believe that firstly, it's imperative that that consideration be made to determine whether exposure to an emissions pricing will actually result in disruptive changes that will result in material financial hardship. So that is imperative. And then secondly, to have a way to consistently assess the risks to financial impacts across all sectors. And then once that's been made, then I think then government can actually get down to the nitty-gritties of specifically what financial support, if required, because that's our recommendation, is that if there's a chance that material financial hardship will be realized by participants in an emissions pricing scheme, that financial support must be offered. Please feel free, Sam, to add anything to that.
No, that sounds good. We've got a question here about some milestones in the advice, which I might just quickly pick up, because it links to our monitoring role. So we'll have our first monitoring report in the middle of 2024, which will assess government's progress towards reducing our emissions across the economy, and we're looking at a range of indicators and milestones to make that assessment. And another question here about GWP Star, which I know is a fairly hot topic. Can you talk about why we haven't recommended using GWP Star?
Hot is probably an understatement, Sam. It's a very, very topical question, one that is quite topical in the media and the discussions that are happening everywhere where we've been. So it's important that we address this question. So the Commission and the government use GWP 100 metric as it is the accepted metric for international reporting and accounting. It's important here to note that metrics are used to quantify the contributions to climate change of different types of emissions. So metrics do not define goals and policy. Rather, these are just tools to enable evaluation and understanding of the different implications of complex policy choices. So if I was to put it simply which emissions to abate. Having said that, the review of the 2050 target set by the government in the Climate Change Response Act, which review is due by December 2024, will include a review of the metrics and will consider all the relevant evidence at the time.
Correct, James, and that gives me a good opportunity to plug in parallel process we've got going on, which is a call for evidence for the 2050 targets review, the advice on emission budgets for the period 2036 to 40, and advice we have to give on whether or not international aviation and shipping should be included in domestic targets. So we're looking for any evidence that people have on those topics, and you can find the link for that on our website. So you can see a couple of questions here that I'll just quickly tackle. One refers to the Business New Zealand report that came out late last week, indicating some vulnerability for jobs in the agricultural sector. As I just mentioned, that came out late last week, and we haven't been able to provide a fully analysed and robust answer to our response to that, but we will take, pardon me, but we will take that into account in our final advice. There's also a question about specific areas in which other legislation interacts with agricultural emissions. If there's particular evidence we should be aware of, we urge people to make a submission on that topic. So if there are any more questions, please do shoot them through, but we've got one here about the Commission's role in the proposed agricultural pricing system. Can you talk about that, please?
Very short answer for you there, Sam. The Commission is still awaiting the government's decision on our involvement in that.
That was not nice and short. Another question that we're often asked is the question about something called emissions leakage. If Aotearoa New Zealand farmers are the most efficient producers in the world with respect to carbon, why should agricultural emissions be priced if it means food and fibre production will increase elsewhere where there would be higher emissions?
Thanks, Sam. So the Commission has assessed available literature specific to agriculture and has come to the conclusion that the risk of emissions leakage is highly uncertain. But it does appear that the risk is low for agriculture in Aotearoa New Zealand in the near term. The Commission also commissioned some modelling from the Agricultural and Economics Research Unit at Lincoln University, and that modelling suggests that pricing agricultural emissions in New Zealand may reduce production domestically, but this does not necessarily increase global emissions. So this is the Commission's view at this point.
Cool. Got a question here about commercially available mitigation technology now and in the future. So can you talk about what maybe farmers could do now and what we think is coming down the pipe?
So that's a very relevant question, especially in light of the recommendations around pricing of emissions. So the Commission's position is that ultimately farmers will have to make decisions on how to reduce emissions based on their individual farm system. So that's the bottom line. So having said that, there's currently a number of mitigation technologies that are evolving rapidly, that are getting closer to being commercially available. And here I'm talking of things like methane inhibitors in feed or boluses, or breeding low methane emissions animals, and also things like additives to methane from effluent. So this is the technology that is in the pipeline. In terms of the here and now, there are other practices that farmers can actually focus on in the meantime, and these are aimed at increasing on-farm efficiencies. And these are things such as precise use of N-fertilizer, improving pasture management so that it increases feed quality and reduce emissions. So what this means is that more of each kilogram of feed eaten gets to go into production with less methane produced. So if we're looking at the here and now, these are some of the things that the Commission thinks farmers may be able to get onto before some of the emissions reduction technologies come onto the market.
Thanks, James. I've got a follow-up from talking about the Commission's role in agricultural pricing. Maybe you can talk about what the government Section 215 report proposed as a role for the Commission.
So in short, the government has proposed that there may be a role for the Commission in helping to determine the methane price. I'm sure you would all be aware that in the proposed emissions pricing system, what is being proposed is farm level levy with split gas, so with a unique methane price, and then also a price for nitrous oxide. So the proposed role for the Commission there is in helping to determine that unique methane price. Was there anything else, Sam, that you wanted to add on to that?
No, that's a good summary of what the report said. What we're waiting for is the details of what that our role in providing that advice would be, including how frequently we'd provide that advice and exactly what form that would take. So our next question is about soil carbon. We have really high soil carbon in Aotearoa New Zealand, and why isn't this getting recognised?
So this is one of those other ones that's also very, very topical as well. So I'll try and explain the Commission's position here. So the Commission is of the view that the science and measurement of soil carbon is still developing. And we are aware, as the Commission, that long-term monitoring programs have been established in New Zealand. So currently the long-term data on whether New Zealand soils are gaining or losing carbon is limited. So with that in mind, the Commission will continue to monitor the science in this area, but the Commission does know that it will take time to establish reliable links between environmental factors, management practices, and soil carbon levels.
Sure, James. We've got only a few minutes to go, so I think we'll close the questions off there. And I'd like to thank you for presenting, and thank you and Matt for answering those questions. Also like to remind people to please make a submission. It's open to the 20th of June. You can find that at haveyoursay.org.nz. www.climatecommission.govt.nz. But if you can't remember that, we're only a Google away. We also have other online events as part of our engagement and consultation. So please check out the website for those as well. And finally, thank you very much for coming and participating. And I'll now invite Bevan to close us off with a karakia.
Tēnā koutou mua koutou whai wāhi I tēnei rā, anei te karakia whakamutunga. Ka hiki te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūru ki ai te ao marama. Haumi e, hui e,
Hi.
Just for those that want a translation for that, it's restrictions are moved aside, so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities, enriched and unified. Thank you very much. Kia ora.
Kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora.
Thank you.